You've watched a political debate and felt something unsettling. Not disagreement with a position. That's normal. But the creeping realization that the candidate everyone's cheering for just promised 5 contradictory things in 3 sentences, and nobody seems to notice or care. You think this makes you arrogant, elitist maybe, someone who doesn't trust the people. What if it means something else entirely? What if you're noticing a gap that's been there for 2,400 years? One that the philosopher who invented Western thought died trying to name. Socrates, the man Athens put to death in 399 BC, spent his final years circling one question that still shows up every election cycle. What if voting isn't a right you're born with, but a skill you need to learn? Not because some people are inherently better than others, but because distinguishing a good argument from a flattering lie is something that can be taught, and when it's not taught, the consequences aren't abstract. They're hemlock. There's a strange tension here. We celebrate ancient Athens as the birthplace of democracy. World leaders get photographed in front of the Parthenon like it's a monument to voting itself. But the civilization that gave us democracy also gave us philosophy. And philosophy looked at democracy the way you might look at a ship with no one at the wheel. Socrates had a thought experiment he'd walk people through. It appears in Plato's Republic, in a conversation with someone named Adimantus. Imagine you're about to sail to Samos, Socrates says. Storm coming, rough seas. Who do you want in charge of the ship? Anyone who happens to be on board? Or someone who's actually studied navigation, wind patterns, star positions, how a hull responds to waves? The answer feels obvious. You'd want someone who knows what they're doing. Then why? Socrates asks, do we assume any random person is qualified to choose who runs a country? Once you see the parallel, something shifts. Voting isn't like having an opinion about music. It's like having an opinion about whether the ship should turn port or starboard in a squall. Get it wrong, and people drown. This is where most people hear elitism and stop listening. But Socrates wasn't arguing for aristocracy. He wasn't saying only the wealthy or well-born should vote. He was making a stranger claim, that voting is a technical skill, like navigation or medicine. And like any technical skill, it requires training. Not training in what to think, training in how to think. How to distinguish sound argument from emotional manipulation. How to spot when someone's solving a real problem versus when they're just telling you what you want to hear. The distinction that gets lost. Socrates wanted what we might call an intellectual democracy, not a democracy of birthright. Democracy of birthright says, you turned 18, here's your vote, good luck. Intellectual democracy says, voting is how we navigate the ship together, and navigation is something you learn. One treats the vote as a right you possess automatically. The other treats it as a capacity you develop deliberately. If you've ever felt the vertigo of watching millions of people make a decision based on a 30-second attack ad, you've brushed against what Socrates was pointing at. Not that people are stupid, that they're unprepared. The question he kept pushing, why do we connect the vote to wisdom in medicine, in engineering, in law, anywhere expertise matters, but disconnect them in politics? A doctor can't practice without demonstrating competence. An engineer can't design bridges without proving they understand load-bearing physics. But choosing who writes the laws those doctors and engineers operate under, that requires no demonstrated capacity for reasoning at all. We've convinced ourselves this is what democracy means. One way to see it, we've confused democracy with a coin flip. Another way, maybe the coin flip is easier to defend than admitting we haven't prepared people for what voting actually requires. Socrates paid for this insight with his life. In 399 BC, Socrates was put on trial. The charges: corrupting the youth of Athens, introducing strange gods, undermining the city. The real crime, asking too many uncomfortable questions about how Athens made decisions. 500 Athenian citizens heard the case. They voted. Narrow margin, but decisive. Guilty. The sentence: death by hemlock. For people who think for a living, this moment carries the same tragic weight that the crucifixion carries for Christians. Not because Socrates was divine, because the mechanism of democracy, direct, participatory, pure, looked at the man asking how to think clearly and decided he was dangerous. 500 voters. Not tyrants. Not a corrupt king. Regular Athenians doing exactly what democracy asked them to do: weigh evidence and render judgment. They got it catastrophically wrong. But here's where the pattern Socrates saw becomes sharpest. Those 500 people weren't monsters. They weren't corrupt. They were responding to what felt true, to charges that sounded credible, to fears that seemed reasonable, to a story about Socrates that made sense if you didn't look too closely. They were people voting without the tools to see they were being manipulated. And Socrates didn't blame them for that. He blamed Athens for giving them the power to judge without teaching them how judgment works. But here's the uncomfortable part. Those 500 voters thought they were thinking clearly. They'd been educated. They'd been trained in rhetoric, in civic duty, in Athenian values. And they still got it catastrophically wrong. What if the problem isn't just lack of training? What if it's that training can point you in the wrong direction, and you'd never know? Athens had a word for what happens when that teaching doesn't exist: demagoguery. Socrates wasn't killed by a demagogue, exactly. He was killed by the system demagoguery creates, a population trained to respond to emotion and rhetoric instead of evidence. The prosecution didn't need to prove Socrates was guilty. They just needed to make him sound dangerous. And Athens had seen this pattern before. They'd lived through it with Alcibiades. If you don't know the name, the shape will be familiar. Alcibiades was everything a crowd wants. Wealthy enough to seem successful, charismatic enough to seem trustworthy, brilliant enough as a speaker to make terrible ideas sound inspired. He'd been Socrates' student once. Let that sink in. The man who argued that voting requires training had trained Alcibiades himself, in logic, in dialectic, in how to spot weak arguments. And Alcibiades used every one of those skills to manipulate Athens into catastrophe, not despite his training. Through it. He knew exactly how to make a bad argument sound airtight. So what does that mean? That Socrates was wrong? Or that there's something even harder here? That teaching people how to think doesn't guarantee they'll use it well. The demagogue doesn't seize power by force. A tyrant does that. The demagogue seizes it by permission, by figuring out what people want to hear and saying it, regardless of whether it's true or wise or even coherent. Alcibiades pushed Athens into the Sicilian expedition, a military adventure that made no strategic sense but sounded magnificent in speeches. Thousands died. The war Athens had been winning turned. The city never fully recovered. All from voting. All from democracy working exactly as designed, with one piece missing: the ability to distinguish a good argument from a seductive one. Now the question sharpens. If Socrates was right that voting requires training, who decides what that training looks like? Who determines whether you're prepared enough to vote? This is the trap intellectual democracy walks into. It sounds like the answer: prepare people to vote wisely, until you ask who decides what wise means. You can see where this goes. What if the people designing the test decide that only people who think like them pass it? What if education becomes code for excluding anyone who doesn't share the right class background, the right cultural assumptions, the right politics? Take the 2008 financial crisis. The people who engineered the collapse, the ones who bundled subprime mortgages into derivatives, who built mathematical models that rated toxic assets as safe, those weren't uneducated people making intuitive mistakes. They were among the most technically trained minds in finance, PhDs in economics, quantitative analysts, people who could navigate complexity that would make most voters' heads spin. And they used all that training to convince themselves and everyone else that infinite growth on borrowed money was sound policy. Not because they were dumb, because they were educated into a framework that valued short-term profit over systemic risk, mathematical elegance over real-world consequences. Education isn't neutral. The question isn't just whether people are taught to think. It's what they're taught to think with. What assumptions get embedded in the training? What counts as a good argument versus a bad one? Socrates knew this, in a way. He didn't want to hand voting to the educated elite of Athens. Those were the people who voted to kill him. He wanted something harder, a culture where asking questions, spotting contradictions, demanding evidence became as natural as breathing. But he never solved how you build that culture, or who gets to decide what clear thinking means when the definition itself is contested. That doesn't mean the question goes away. It means the question is harder than we want it to be. We've built monuments to democracy. We celebrate it as an unambiguous good, a system that by its nature produces just outcomes because it reflects the will of the people. What if it reflects something else? What if democracy reflects the judgment of the people? And judgment isn't automatic, isn't neutral, isn't guaranteed to improve just because more people have it. When we give the vote without connecting it to the capacity for clear thinking, we don't necessarily get democracy. We get what Socrates warned about: a system where the most compelling storyteller wins, regardless of whether the story is true. You've probably noticed this. The candidate who promises easy solutions beats the one who explains why the problem is complicated. The one who validates what people already believe beats the one who asks them to reconsider, not because voters are foolish, because we've handed them a responsibility we never prepared them for. The question Socrates posed wasn't whether democracy is good or bad. It was, what kind of democracy are we building? One that prepares people for the weight of their vote, or one that hands them the decision and hopes they figure it out in real time? Maybe the real question isn't whether we need intellectual democracy. It's whether we can build one that doesn't become its own form of tyranny. Tyranny of the educated over those deemed unprepared. Socrates didn't have an answer that doesn't create new problems. That doesn't mean the question disappears. It means we're still on the ship, still trying to figure out how to navigate, still arguing about who should hold the wheel and what they need to know before they touch it. If you felt that vertigo, watching people choose the sweet story over the true one, watching the person asking uncomfortable questions get voted down by the person making comfortable promises, you're standing where Socrates stood, seeing the gap between what democracy could be and what it becomes when we don't teach people how to think through what they're voting for. The ship is still moving. And the question isn't settled. It probably never will be. But noticing the gap, that's where it starts.